Hi everyone. Today's episode is guaranteed to keep you on your toes. I have 3 stories that will challenge your mind and keep you puzzled until there aren't any pieces left. You might even find that you're missing a few pieces. But first, cover up those toes and get them comfortable because they are about to be busy. But first, please tickle that subscribe button. Great. Now let's get into the stories. I enjoy tuning into your channel occasionally, but I never fully believed in all of this stuff. To me, it was just fun to listen to and think about, but that was about it. However, I had a particularly bizarre experience this past week, and I've been kind of stuck on what I now believe, basically at a loss as to what's the truth. But I realized that you and your audience are the best people to tell this to. I'm writing this from a bed and breakfast in Western Massachusetts. My husband and I came here on vacation to see the local art museums and to visit with his family. My husband grew up in the suburbs of Boston, but his family went on vacation in the Berkshires all the time. We were both feeling burnt out from city life and considering buying a house with some land. But the main purpose of this visit was just to de-stress and get the lay of the land. We arrived at the bed and breakfast late in the evening. We had booked the small cabin behind the main house. It was a charming, cozy spot that had everything we needed. Just walking in it, I could take deeper breaths. I was so thrilled that I would get to relax a bit and it would be a good time to think about our next steps. That night, when my husband was in the shower, I was lying in bed looking at Zillow properties that would be in our pay grade. It was raining steadily and we had spent the evening watching old movies. I lost track of Zillow and the shower noises and the rain outside, and I found myself just staring into space. One of those moments where you think about everything and nothing at the same time. Fully present and at the same time 150 feet above your body. And this is when I heard the tapping noises. It sounded like something was tapping on the window. I looked over to the window to see if that was the case, but didn't see anything. The rain was still falling, but it had faded to the background. I had renewed interest in my surroundings now, and I began wandering around the cabin looking to all the windows. There had to be a source of this strange tapping that had just suddenly started. At first, I couldn't see anything that would illuminate the source of the noise. Maybe I was imagining things. Something bouncing around in my subconscious. But then, I saw it. This is a prank. That was my first thought, but in the bottom corner window pane, I saw a tiny little hand tapping the glass of the front window by the porch. I must have jumped up a foot. I sat back down, scooting myself as far as I could away towards the opposite wall. I could do nothing else but stare at the window. The finger was stubby and short, and the hand that it belonged to was shriveled like the root of a tree. It tapped in a simple rhythm in threes. Tap, 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 tap. This went on for another 30 seconds. Felt like an eternity to me. The tapping eventually ceased and the hand disappeared with a gentle slide along the glass of the window. I took some deep breaths and I did a little inventory of what I could have possibly seen. Mustering up some courage, I decided to step out onto the porch to see what I could find. Nothing seemed out of place. My husband came out of the shower and saw that I was tense, and now back sitting on the bed. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine. I was very reluctant to share what I had just seen because I didn't fully believe it myself. Eventually we went to bed, and needless to say, I had a difficult time falling asleep. So I ended up rolling around and looking at my phone. I eventually rolled onto my shoulder and looked out the window once again, and to my shock, that same lower corner window pane now had a pair of bright yellow eyes staring in through it. They were human in appearance and staring directly towards us. I sat straight up, shocked at what I was seeing. As I looked longer, I realized that the eyes were part of a wrinkled little face, and instead of hair on top of its head were these several short spikes. Summoning up some bravery, I got out of bed and I walked towards the front door of the cabin. The thing in the window seemed to nod and smile when I did this. I don't know what prompted me to get up. I just put my jacket on and walked outside. But once I did so, I looked around. it was gone. There was just some rustling noises in the woods nearby. I walked towards the noise, looking around for this little creature. Eventually, I saw those same eyes in the distance up in a tree, so I ended up hiking to the top of this hill where those were. Once I was close to the tree, I stopped and looked up at the creature. I then took a few steps forward, hoping to get a little closer to see it better. My gaze was up towards the tree, locked in a stare with the creature, so much so that I didn't notice I was walking towards the edge of a cliff. Because of the trance that it had me in, I nearly fell to what would have been a serious injury. I looked back at the yellow eyes in the tree. They blinked. And then the creature crawled up the tree and disappeared. This is when I seemed to come back to my senses, and I hightailed it back to the cabin, jumped back into bed. I have no idea how my husband didn't wake during all of this, which is almost what scared me the most. Did this creature have him in some kind of a trance too? I then looked at the clock. Only 10 minutes had passed. Did this even really happen? I decided to relay it all to my husband as if it had been a dream, and then I just decided to go with that in my own head too. Since then, the trip has been completely normal, at least up until right now as I sit here writing this to you. No more sightings of that little creature. I've been a little nervous, though, traveling around up here, trying to keep my wits about me to make sure that I'm not led off somewhere where I shouldn't be led. I hope this story is interesting to you and your audience, and a reminder to all of you to be careful out there. In the woods, there are so many things that we don't understand. I have always been a nature enthusiast and adventurer, constantly seeking new experiences outdoors. So when I decided to embark on a solo trip to Acadia National Park, I was thrilled at the prospect of exploring the beautiful wilderness of Maine. Little did I know that my trip would turn into a nightmare, one that I would never forget. It was the third night of my trip, and I had set up camp in a secluded area of the park. The sun had just set as I was settling in for the night. Before long, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I assumed it was just a deer or some other harmless animal, so I didn't pay it much attention. But as the rustling continued, I began to feel uneasy. Suddenly, a massive creature emerged from the bushes. It stood at least 10 feet tall with shaggy fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Its eyes were a piercing blue, glowing with a fierce intensity. Its face was a cross between a wolf and a bear, with razor-sharp teeth that glinted in the darkness. Its arms were long and muscular, ending in huge paws with razor-sharp claws. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature let out a low growl, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It was like a primal instinct had kicked in, telling me that I was in grave danger. As the creature charged towards me with incredible speed, I scrambled to grab my backpack, fumbling with the zipper in my panic. I knew that I had to get out of there fast if I wanted to survive. The creature was almost upon me, its massive jaws gaping open as it prepared to strike. But just as it was about to pounce, it suddenly stopped, as if it had hit an invisible wall. It then let out a deafening roar that echoed through the park before disappearing back into the darkness. I was left there, shaken, terrified, wondering what had just happened. It was like a dream that I couldn't shake off, but the claw marks on the trees and the gouges in the ground were evidence that it had been real. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. I talked to rangers and other hikers, hoping for some kind of explanation. Some said that it was just a mystical creature from legend passed down from Native American folklore, while others insisted that it was a real creature that roamed the wilderness. As for me, I knew that I had encountered something that was beyond my understanding. It was a creature that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a testament to the raw power of nature. And while I'll never forget the fear that I felt that night in Acadia National Park, I will always cherish the memory of that incredible experience. The next story I'm sharing here is so insane that the woman who shared it has asked to be referred to by the name of Michelle, which isn't her real name. She says that the encounter was so intense that she hasn't shared it with anyone, mainly because she doesn't want to take the chance of having to live with the stigma of being called that woman. The encounter starts by Michelle leaving her house on the morning of November 19th, 2003 for her daily run before work. It was early morning and an unusually warm morning for November in Michigan, which can be very cold, especially where she lived in East Lansing, in an apartment near Michigan State University. The sun had just started to peek over the horizon, which meant that the temperatures would now slowly start to creep upwards. At this time, the streets were still mostly deserted, with only a few cars driving by every now and then, which was exactly how Michelle liked it. Mornings like this were what kept her head clear and sane. She had a usual route that she ran, and her body could do it on autopilot. She ran along the road because it had a sidewalk and felt safe. This particular day, she was deep in thought as her feet rhythmically hit the ground, thinking of a vacation that she had coming up with a group of girls, when all of a sudden she heard commotion in a grouping of bushes nearby. Now, ordinarily, strange noises wouldn't have fazed her since she's always been more of a city girl, and she knew that it was usually best to ignore strange noises and just move away from them quickly. But this noise was different. It sounded large, like whatever was making the noise was big. Michelle quickly remembered the flyers she saw in her apartment building by the mailboxes for a neighbor's missing dog, which had last been seen 3 days ago. Her first thought was wondering if it could be that dog. She knew she had to check. She couldn't forgive herself if she didn't, and so she quickly stopped and tried to peer behind the bushes, trying to see what was making the noise. As she leaned forward, trying to get a better view, suddenly out of the shadows stepped this very large, wolf-like creature. It was easily as big as a full-grown man, and it was now standing completely upright and staring at her. Michelle stood there with her eyes wide as saucers. She could see that it was the size of a very large German shepherd standing on its long back legs, with a long neck, large furry head, and fur-covered arms that hung lower than seemed to be normal. But of course, nothing about this was normal. Its fur was light brown with some black mixed in. She remembers wishing she had mace on her. She clearly felt danger emanating from the creature. It then began to slowly walk towards her and then just stopped, stood there, staring at her for an amount of time that seemed like forever. And then the wind began to pick up and the scent of the creature hit her. It was rank, putrid, a smell that made her nauseous. Eventually it turned around and walked away into the woods, leaving Michelle standing there, completely dumbfounded, watching it as it melted back into the darkness from the direction it had come. Michelle remained frozen in place for a few moments after the creature disappeared, and then she immediately abandoned the rest of her run and turned around to make her way back home, trying to make sense of what she had seen, but also trying not to think about it so that she could get herself home safely. The whole way back, she tried to tell herself that it was just a large dog, but she knew that wasn't the truth. It had been too big, too feral, too much like a werewolf. And then before getting too far, she thought about turning around to try and see if she really had just experienced this creature. But she quickly realized that that was a really bad idea, considering she was alone, and it was so early in the morning. The rest of the neighborhood was likely still asleep, so she abandoned that idea for now, but told herself that one day she would go back looking to try to find whatever it was that she had seen. As she started off back home, she could still smell the creature, and then off in the distance, she thought she heard a howl that sounded almost human, and then additional howls that sounded like they were coming from the same direction. She ran home as fast as she could, not wanting to be caught out in the open if that thing came back. When she got back to her house, she quickly locked all of her doors and windows, making sure everything was secure, and then called the police. It took a while for them to arrive, and by the time they did, the sun was up, and she could see their cruiser pull into the driveway. Michelle ran out to meet them and recounted her story to the officers. but they didn't seem too concerned. They told her they would head over to the area she mentioned and look around. They also promised to look into it and see if anybody else in the neighborhood had reported anything similar, but she never heard back from them, and she decided not to reach back out. She figured that they wouldn't find anything anyway, because whatever she had seen that morning was long gone by now. She was sure of it. She was convinced that it was smart enough to know that it shouldn't be seen by the light of day. The whole incident left her feeling unsettled, and she began to feel like she was being watched. She was careful to lock her doors and windows every night, but still, every time she went outside, she felt like eyes were on her, judging her, waiting for her. And not only from the creature, but she felt self-conscious that people knew her story and were now judging her when they saw her. The encounter was basically eating away at her self-confidence and even her sanity. But she never did see the creature again, and eventually she convinced herself that it had all just been a dream, a very vivid dream at that, because the alternative, believing in it, was just too difficult. So now, even years later, she still hears those howls sometimes, now mostly in her dreams, and she still lets the thoughts into her mind that it might, just might have been real.